So we'll be starting next panel, hosted by the Global CCS Institute. And this panel will focus on scaling CCS deployment in emerging economies. We thought it would be very important, actually, to organize this session because, CCS, we've just heard in the previous panel, my colleague Lauren Turan mentioned that CCS is really picking up. The Global CCS Institute does tracking of CCS projects every year. And this year, we've seen a massive increase of 102% from last year. So now there are 392 projects in the pipeline. So CCS is really picking up. But it also needs to be picked up in the emerging economies. So far, we've been seeing leading roles for CCS deployment in the US and Europe because there are conducive policies in those geographies. But we all know that CCS will also be needed all over the world, and especially in emerging economies where the industries are developing, where we see development of heavy emitting industries like cement, steel, chemicals, and also where we see still fossil fuel in power generation. Maybe in some of the developed economies, the market is moving already into higher deployment of renewables. But in emerging economies, especially in some of the countries, coal, for example, is still an indigenous important resource. So how do we decarbonize while still kind of using this capacity in the power and at the same time developing industrial production? So this is exactly the question of this session. So how do we decarbonize using carbon management technologies in emerging economies? And we have a great panel today. So I'll introduce our panel, and then each of them will introduce themselves, and then we'll have a couple of Q&A to the panel. So we have Natalia Weber with us. She is the director of CCS Brazil. We have Professor Jia Li from the Hong Kong University. She'll talk to us about developments in China. We have Paul Zakur, who is the director of Carbon Counts. And Paul has been following carbon capture and storage, different methodologies, markets for years, for decades, I should say. And also we have with us Sadej Sukraj from the International Finance Corporation, which is a very important player, of course, in financing decarbonization and carbon management in emerging economies. So let us move now to the panel. And maybe, Jai, if you could introduce yourself and maybe in a few words, what you do in this space.
Hello, everyone. We're glad to be here. My name is Jia Li. I'm from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Guangzhou. And I've been working on carbon capture and storage for nearly 20 years now. When I started working, we were still arguing whether pre-combustion, post-combustion, or oxy fuel will take the lead. So nobody knows. So the funding scheme was like funding all the projects. It seems to be now post-combustion has a lot more projects going on in Asia. But then for pre-combustion, there are also quite a lot of large number in other parts of the world. So my personal interest on this is always the capture side, and I'm not a storage expert, but we always need to link with a storage project in China to make a project goes on, or a utilization part. And recently, I've also been working on direct air capture, especially to develop low-cost solid sorbents for the technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Aileen. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. I'm Natalia Weber. I'm co-founder and director of CCS Brazil, along with Isabela Morbach, that is here with us. And CCS Brazil is the Brazilian Association for Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage Technologies. We founded CCS Brazil in less than 2 years, but I might say that in 2 years we had great improvements in the country. And I'm really happy to be speaking here before we had yesterday the launching of the Carbon Management Challenge, and where we could see the important role that Brazil can be playing in this challenge. And we had a very important signal coming from the Brazilian government about the commitment and the bold ambitions towards the deployment of CCUS in Brazil. And we've been working really hard in these less than 2 years to bring awareness, both in the industry and the government. Actually, in the research in Brazil, in academia in Brazil, we have a long tradition on CCUS technologies, not just in the engineering part of it, but also in policy and regulation. But now we are working to integrate the other stakeholders so we can actually deploy CCUS projects at the scale we need to have the decarbonization strategy effective for the country and for the world as well. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paul Zakor. I'm ostensibly not a developing country delegate. I'm from the UK and I live in Germany, but I have worked extensively in the developing world as well as the developed world. In fact, I started my work on CCS back in around 2002, 2003, working with the EU to develop the whole legal and regulatory framework and incentives programs there, but also during that time working in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia on project feasibility studies. Back then we were talking about CDM. We worked with BP on the Insala project to do a CDM program potentially for a project in Algeria, a real CCS project. We worked in Brazil with Petrobras, who I was just telling Natalia, back in the 2000s, Petrobras actually hosted 2 international conferences on CCS, which I was part of, and also Tim Dixon in the audience was there too. And in China with NZEC, there was a big program launched in 2008-09, run by firstly the UK under the G8 presidency, and then through the European Commission, and also in Southern Africa, in Brazil, South Africa, Botswana, and Mozambique, all of those. So I have quite a good worldview on what's going on in these areas, and hopefully I'll bring that to the discussion today. And I've got a few thoughts that I think we need to perhaps ground us in where we're going on this and what we need to solve and how we can perhaps solve them.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure being here. My name is Suresh Sukraj, and I feel like I've been tied to CO2 for almost my entire life. My graduate degree a long, long time ago was actually in the design of catalyst systems to convert CO2 into useful chemicals, and I had a lot less gray hair at that time. The World Bank has actually been very active in this space since 2009 via the CCS Trust Fund, and we have funded studies, as Paul well knows, in multiple regions. And over the last few years, the IFC has collaborated very closely with the World Bank in a series of studies. The most recent one we completed was actually in Nigeria, where we looked at mapping the sources of CO2 emissions, the quantities, and looking at storage. We are currently looking at several other regions in terms of studies. The IFC recently embarked on a global industrial decarbonization initiative for the hard-to-abate sectors, and I guess I'll touch on that a little bit later. And for those of you who were here earlier in the week, you would have heard the announcements from the World Bank and the IFC on the commitment with respect to the quantum that they will be dedicating towards climate and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe let me first start with Natalia, because you mentioned that the government is quite supportive of CCS. There are a couple of legislative proposals that include CCS as the priority solution. Also, Brazil has experience with CCS projects. So it seems like the enabling environment is there. So what else is needed, from a regulatory point of view, supportive policies, support, financial support, for CCS to really take off in Brazil?
Thank you, Eileen. Yes, we see now a very different moment in the political landscape for CCUS projects. We had yesterday Thiago Barral, which is our Secretary of Energy Transition in Brazil, talking about a legislation for biofuels that includes CCUS as a priority area, which is, again, a very important signal that the government is giving to the industry as a whole. But we also have another very important, I'd say, key regulatory proposal, which is a bill that it was already approved in the Senate, now it's being discussed in the Chamber of Deputies, which was partially written by Isabella here, and it's bringing a actual regulatory framework with all the concepts and the liability issues that we need to be addressed in a regulatory framework. So we are expecting to have that approved soon. We can never say when exactly, right? It's being discussed in the Senate, in the Congress. But this is the first step for having more projects announced. Companies are waiting for these, for having more certainty in the regulatory landscape for announcing their projects. This is key, we know that. But we also know that we're going to have a very important issue after that, which is the environmental licensing process. And this is going to be important to be addressed in each state, so not just by the federal government. And we don't want to see the same struggles we are seeing in regulatory, in the environmental licensing in other countries, such as the US. So we have a lot to learn from that experience, and having the process faster and more effective in Brazil. The other thing that is important is that we don't have a perspective for incentives like we see in the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, and other countries. We are facing important fiscal situations as an emerging country. But we are discussing also in the Congress the framework for emission trading systems, which can be an important incentive for the industry to decarbonize, and see CCUS as an important solution for that. So I think this is the most important topics that is finally being addressed in Brazil, and we are hoping to have good or positive answers in the near term.
Yep. Thank you very much. And I think Brazil is setting actually a very good example of starting with regulatory frameworks, looking for incentive policies in your own circumstances, including carbon trading or price on carbon. So, and you mentioned that you're learning from the U.S. experience. So we will touch maybe a little bit more on kind of the importance of learning, sharing, and kind of learning from each other, best practice approaches around the world. But let us now move to another part of the world, maybe China. And we've seen a lot of already CCS development in China. There are projects. There have been a lot of R&D investments. The Chinese government has been supporting CCS projects. So what is your assessment of the situation? Can we see more? Do you think we should expect more CCS projects in China? And what are the incentives in China to develop CCS?
Thank you. I think at the moment, China probably have around 4 million of capture project, or around 2 million tons of storage project per year. And this is the number. I can't remember the detailed number, but I think this is roughly right. And it's estimated by 2030, the number might go up to around 24 to about 30 million tons of the capture project in terms of size. So the number is definitely growing. But also bear in mind that the first project was started in 2008 during the Olympic Games. That was only a 3,000 tons per year capture project. And since that project, it's been slowly developed until probably around 2020, when there is this 2030 carbon peaking and 2060 carbon neutrality goal was announced. It wasn't until after that policy then the CCS project started to get loads of attention. And also President Xi Jinping went to visit a storage site in the north part of China. And then people start to realize, okay, this is one of the important technology. We can't just be relying on renewable. So this is what we estimate in the future, all the numbers of CCS from coal-powered power plant and also from biomass plus CCS will grow. But also kind of bear in mind that at the first collaboration between like international collaboration, which you sorry about your name, mentioned during the NZ and also the coach, capacity building and knowledge transfer is very important. So I think we have Beth here from Canada and also team from IEHG. So those were all those experts originally came to China very early in the 2000 or 2010 to help us, or we talk through conferences or just workshops to know what is going on around the world and what can we do with our own oil fields or power plants. And China is also famous for cutting the cost of all technologies. So once they start rolling, I think the cost will just go down. And once the costs start to go down, then everything will start to grow. We've kind of in this regular routine to write up the roadmaps for CCS development in China now. Previously was after 6 or 7 years, we were thinking, okay, we haven't updated that, maybe we should rewrite it again. But now the target is different. We need to write a roadmap to make other companies aware of the importance of the technology. Because I've also been involved in some of the Asian Development Bank funded projects in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, and Philippines. So most of the questions that were asked from those countries are, who's going to give us the money? The first part, maybe the first money could come from international society or some development bank. But after a while, the self-driven force is more important. Like they need to have their own country goal, similar to what China is doing, and then they will be able to cut down the emissions in a much faster pace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think, from the two interventions from Brazil and China, I think maybe two important already conclusions that we can make, that the regulatory regimes or the goals, the climate goals, emission reduction goals the government set up are the primary drivers for technology deployment. And you both mentioned exchange of information, learning from others, and you mentioned international collaboration, people coming to China, Brazil is talking to the US, learning from the US, and so we already kind of see two key pieces of the puzzle in developing CCS and emerging economies. But I would like to maybe turn to the International Finance Corporation. And based on your experience, you mentioned that there are a couple of projects, a couple of studies. What are the focuses of those studies? Like, what are you seeing as the most important in terms of your intervention in emerging economies? Like, what type of work are you funding, and what conditions are you looking for in receiving countries in order to be more effective with your studies, your projects there?
I think given the infancy of CCUS, we have tried to be very flexible in our approach. And as I mentioned earlier, we have decided to focus on the hard-to-abate sectors initially. And what we're trying to do is, given the lack of capacity and often the lack of technology, we are trying to actually help facilitate access to technology. We are trying to help build capacity. But at the same time, we're looking at the entire value chain. You heard earlier people talking about the costs. Obviously, you have the developed markets with the various mechanisms that help the deployment. That's a negative and a positive. The positive for us is, with adoption, we see costs coming down, which is a good thing for the emerging markets, and hopefully they can benefit from that. There's also the aspect where, with adoption, is the technology risk comes down. So it makes it easier to deploy, and that's a plus as well. Now, on the negative side, obviously, we are seeing things like CBAM, which is putting pressure to expedite the deployment of these technologies. So we are trying to work and facilitate that. And what the IFC does very well, it's a very pioneering institution. We led the way with green finance, with sustainability-linked finance, and we continue to expand that portfolio. We're building that portfolio wider to try and help expedite the deployment of these carbon capture technologies. At the same time, we are bringing to the fore our huge workforce. We have industry specialists, we have ENS experts, and we have finance guys. So we bring all of that. We have started to get involved in co-development, which is things we were not doing before. So we would go in and we would actually work in countries with specific partners and do co-development, advisory, upstream work, project development. And then in parallel, we work with the other funding agencies. And one of the big initiatives that we are on the finance side, we are looking to mobilize more. We have limited funds, but unlimited demands. So mobilization is a key aspect that we are starting to focus on. And then we have started to also invest in startups and new technologies. And we are hoping to try to bridge the gap by investing in the next generation of technologies. Means we have access and are able to take them into the emerging markets as well. So we try to pull all of that together and get a package that tries to help the various emerging markets deploy and accelerate. At the same time, obviously, everyone's touched on the regulatory environment. We try to engage as well on that and push it in a certain direction. And I think that coalescence of all those various initiatives is how we try to expedite that. Our studies are primarily focused on the risk side of things, but at the same time, we try to build out and find areas that are viable. We've actually funded in Brazil cement. We've done in Senegal. We've actually made a huge investment in Senegal, also in the cement industry. We've invested in a next-gen metals technology company as well, and we're hoping to bring all of that to the fore. So it is all of these things that we see coming together and helping enable and scale.
Well, thank you very much. And I would like maybe to ask Paul, because you mentioned several challenges that you're trying to address through the limited financing you have. But I wanted to ask Paul, you've worked in multiple countries in early days and recently. What are the challenges? Of course, we all know the money. Everybody's looking for funds. That's the biggest challenge. But what are other things that you've observed that maybe we should start looking into while, the finance is mobilizing?
Yeah, I think we can talk about bankability of projects and bankability of finance, but we also need to think about the bankability of the carbon, the reductions or the removals that these projects deliver, and that's something that we don't seem to have touched upon yet, and we're an hour and 15 into this session, and I think this is absolutely critical, because if we look at what the Paris Agreement calls for, it calls for countries to count for actions towards their NDCs. Article 6 also requires accounting. And when we look in what the transparency framework asks for, it asks for the application of IPCC method and standards. Now, buried in there are some very significant text relating to CCS. Firstly, that unless you are monitoring and reporting your storage site in coherence with the requirements therein, you cannot count the reduction or removal of CO2 at the point source. You have to add it back on your inventory. So that's a very important thing. You can do the CCS project, but if it doesn't, the MRV isn't up to scratch, then it won't actually be able to be counted towards your NDC, which would be simply a ridiculous situation to arise. Now, if you actually drill into them what the guidelines say, they create basically a liability and permanence framework that's built on regulation and regulatory standards. And so when we've tried to convert that into a crediting framework and crediting program like we did under the CDM back over the period 2006 through to about 2011, we spent a lot of time setting a quasi-regulatory framework for countries to follow in generating credits for their CCS projects thereunder. And so the expectation was that countries would therefore react and respond and implement their own national legal and regulatory frameworks. I then, as Satish mentioned, spent some time working under the World Bank Trust Fund to try and create those legal and regulatory frameworks in many, many countries. And it's not that straightforward. Sometimes there's constitutional barriers, sometimes there's just political pressure not to go for these projects, sometimes there's incoherent regulatory frameworks. So on about 6 or 7 different countries I've worked in, none of those countries have yet passed a legal or regulatory framework applicable to CCS. So I think there are some significant barriers there. So what what we're trying to do now through Article 6 is to say, okay, we have this problem. Should we just keep hoping that countries pass their legal and regulatory frameworks to help us identify permanent reductions, or can we do more to help? So actually, IETA started a program a couple of years back where we looked at what safeguards would we want to see in crediting standards to make projects bankable and credits bankable therein. And that culminated last year in the publication of the high-level criteria for carbon geological storage, which was really just trying to give some guardrails to what we'd expect to see projects do to get bankable credits. I'm talking about carbon here. Since then, we've had things like CCS Plus and Gold Standard producing new standards, and also just a couple of weeks back, a project I was involved in was, this is a shameless plug I'm going to come up with now, which is the Global Carbon Council methodology, and I'll be talking about it in 45 minutes over the road there, is really trying to create that framework that makes projects meet these standards, particularly the IPC standard, to make them bankable, to make them compliant with MRV best practice standards. So when we go into a project credited under an Article 6 program, we know that those credits have been awarded against best practice, they're fungible, they're transferable, which is key to counting towards NDC. So I think we need to think a little bit more flexibly about how we set these regulatory frameworks. Well, Natalia, was very interesting to hear about what's going on in Brazil, but as you mentioned, it's going to be potentially a long road because of the pressure on parliamentary time in many countries and the lack of sort of potentially energy in this area for parliamentarians to own it and champion these things. So I've seen that challenge firsthand, and it can really be a real problem. So I think we need to be a bit more flexible if we want to accelerate very quickly into deployment phase for these technologies, and I think that's probably what I would take away from this talk today.
Thank you, Paul. So the accounting, monitoring, standards, that are all important features, and they take time to develop, and they need regulatory frameworks. But I wanted to turn to Natalia, because you mentioned regulatory frameworks, but I know you've also mentioned in some previous discussions there are some other challenges, not just the regulations, but other challenges like awareness, acceptance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, basically, I would say that in CCS Brazil, one of our most important topic is definitely public awareness, public perception, engagement, because we know right now CCUS are technologies that are not so well known, even by the companies. Now companies are understanding better, but in the public, the general public really doesn't understand the concept or what CCUS is really addressing, what kind of solution is that. So we have this moment now to establish the concepts and a good communication to communities and the broad population in Brazil. But we know that it will be, we need to pay attention carefully to this issue, because we have, the population in Brazil is really big, right? Brazil is a big country. We have different realities, regional, the different regions can behave and perceive these technologies in very different ways. We must be aware of these differences, how to address that. And we know that climate change I don't know, until last year, climate change wasn't an important topic in people's minds. We have other problems we're facing as emerging economies. We are concerned about corruption, about inflation, about public safety. So climate change is not a big issue for the general population. Now this is changing. We had a new research on that is showing that most of Brazilians are concerned about climate change. So this is positive for having some kind of engagement in decarbonization solutions. But we are also seeing how misinformation is spreading and in everywhere, basically, about CCUS technologies. We've heard about some of these things today here in the last panel, in the panel we were earlier. And we know this will be hard to face. We don't have any strong community against CCUS now, but we have many experiences, or some important experiences, with big engineering projects in Brazil They are not related with CCUS at all, but we know that people may understand there's something as something similar, and will feel that that kind of hazards may happen in CCUS projects as well. So we have to be really careful about how we communicate with the different communities and regions we have in Brazil. I think this is the one of the most important issues we see in CCS Brazil.
Thank you, Natalia. And Professor Jiali, in China, is that also an issue, or China is very used to now, industrialization, big industrial projects, and people, don't have such a perception on CCS. They take it as a part of another industrial development, or you see that also an issue in China in terms of acceptance or understanding of CCS. And another question maybe, like, what are other challenges that you may see in China in terms of further CCS development?
Well, I think China is quite relaxed on this matter because it's just part of the process to clean up the world, I think. So they don't have a lot of concerns on, like, where the plant is, especially most of those plants are either power plants, which is already quite remote, or industry plants that's also quite remote. And also the people working in those industries, they are already quite used to the concept. And it's probably also because these like 30-60 carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goal has been announced or advertised everywhere, so people are aware of the importance. So regulatory part, I don't think that's a problem. And maybe one thing that's probably as a technical barrier is not all the power plants or industrial plants can get retrofit. So people always have this like misunderstanding. If I got a power plant, then I'll be able to retrofit a power plant when I want it and when it's necessary. But the case is, most of those plants were built at a very like compact stages, or they are not very close to a storage site. So that will bring these technology challenges to retrofit them. So that's one issue. And the other might be comes from the finance part, because I also listened to the previous session. So China is not supporting CCS in a like national level through the finance or the carbon market. It's mainly through a company trying to achieve its own target of carbon reduction. So that's quite different from probably the EU or the US, where they have this national level or like a cross-border level of subsidy on this. China doesn't have that, or the money is not big enough to support any projects to happen. So that might be the biggest challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's quite interesting that we identified, even in this panel of 4 people, we already identified multiple challenges that are different in different geographies. Regulatory challenges, public perception challenges, technical challenges of retrofitting, location of storage and capture, availability of financing. So there are multiple challenges. So I'd like to go back to Sadesh and from multilateral development banks or financing corporations. Like, what would be your ideal vision? Like, if we were on the road together, deploying or developing CCS in emerging economies, how would you go about that? Like, what should we fund first, or what to do? Like, you've heard all these challenges already listed, and you've had experience before. So, what maybe differently should we do going into the future in terms of creating the environment that CCS takes off?
I think I want to latch on to Paul's earlier comment. I think in the ideal world, the first thing we should have done is actually developed a set of standards that everybody accepted and everybody works against, because that would have taken out all the unevenness across the world. After all, we may have artificial lines on a map, CO2 or greenhouse gases. Have no idea that those lines are there and they should stay within those borders. They travel all over. So we should have a global standard that everybody follows and everybody accepts. And I think that would be a good starting point. I think the other thing that we have been looking at is reshaping how we think about carbon capture. And we've started toying around with new business models. Can we look at CCUS as a service? We are looking also on the utilization side. There have been now several new CO2 utilization technologies that have been deployed at commercial scale. Can we expedite that? What are the risks associated with that? Because that changes the conversation. The moment you actually take something that's an expense and suddenly you change it into a feedstock for a different product that generates a revenue, that fundamentally changes the equation and changes the conversation. So I think these are things that we are looking at. Methodologies are key for us. The IFC has been doing this for ages. We developed the green building program, the EDGE tool, that now has become the industry standard. We are now pushing forward with respect to decarbonization, working with the various industry associations. We have finalized a cement tool, which the cement industry would be able to utilize. We are now looking at steel, the chemicals, the fertilizer sector. And typically, we try to get these models out and available to everybody, because in a way that facilitates the conversation and convergence towards a common set of standards. So coming back to your question, if I had to choose, I think having a common and accepted methodology would be the ideal starting point.
I think maybe Paul will agree with you. And maybe the question to Paul, you mentioned the regulatory frameworks and the time it takes to develop regulatory frameworks in each country. Yeah, what would you recommend to speed that up? Can we speed it up? What are the recipes?
It's a very simple ingredient. It's called money. As soon as you start throwing money at things, these problems start to dissolve, I think, and I think that's really the nub of the challenge. Can we put enough finance and enough skin in this game to make people want to or need to have to do this to meet their climate mitigation targets? And if that imperative exists, and it exists with real teeth, all the other things will dissolve away. So I'm sort of spent 20 years talking about CCS, and everybody focuses on the challenges, and you sort of always come away going, oh God, it's impossible. But we think we just need to think about more creatively. There's a diversity of projects out there, diversity of costs, a diversity of situations. The market can help us find those opportunities that are least cost in the right places, the Goldilocks zone, as you could call it, where it's not too expensive, the legal and permitting framework can function, and there's appetite for the government to do these things. And I think that's really, we need to find those little eggs and nurture them into real projects. And I think there's plenty of little places around the world. We've got Natalia doing her thing in Brazil. We've got Mozambique, people like Mozambique signing up to the Carbon Management Challenge. There's a lot of opportunity in the South China Sea around the gas storage fields there. So lots and lots of little bits and pieces that we need to, not instead of just looking at CCS as a blanket or it's really hard, what we need to understand is some of it's really hard, but some of it's actually quite easy and affordable and doable. And without a lot of money and a lot of effort, we can make these things happen. So if there's one takeaway, not to think about the challenges, but think about the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great conclusion. And maybe before we finalize here, I think we have maybe a few minutes left. I would like to ask all of you to think very briefly. We have this target now in the Carbon Management Challenge, but also if we look at the scenarios, there is 1 gigaton of CO2 that needs to be delivered through the carbon capture and storage by 2030. So 7 years, 1 gigaton. Today we're capturing and storing 50 million. So it's a big challenge. And we have here, some of us, we're players in this market. So what do you want to do in this next 7 years to contribute to meeting that target of 1 gigaton? So just maybe 1, 2, 3 things you would like to say based on what you do and how your vision of what you would like to see in your country or globally in CCS, whatever comes to mind.
I probably can't say 1, 2, 3, but probably at least 1 or 2. So number 1 definitely is having more demonstration project builds. So we have probably around more than 10 projects. Each one of that is over 500,000 tons in terms of capture size. But just having capture is not enough. A lot of the problem lies on the, where do we find the storage site that's linked with a certain capture project. So having kind of break down the tunnel between those two is very important and crucial. So I guess the solution will only comes in with regulatory framework to help to facilitate this. Thank you.
Well, I think basically the most important thing that we need is including it. First of all, collaboration, right? Collaboration is the key for us to deploy these technologies at scale. But I'd say that we need more than collaboration. We need the emerging countries to be more included in the discussions, such as we are having many panels here, including and seeing. We are seeing the visions of these countries. We are facing different challenges. The challenge is big enough for everybody, but for emerging economies, it's even harder. We have lack of access to energy. So talking about energy transition, when we have many people without access to energy, it's way more difficult. So it's important to for all the countries to see the specificities that emerging countries are facing, so we can actually collaborate, we can be actually part of the solution. As we know, it is key for all of us to meet our gigaton scale.
Yeah, I could probably just limit it to two things. Firstly, let's get the MRV standard fixed and agreed. I think that's really important. I think we have a lot of work already done in that space, so not a lot of needed to do to get there. But secondly, to scale the imperative, as I was saying, if there's enough imperative and enough people with skin in the game who need to do CCS, then projects will start to happen. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I think I'm going to agree with Paul on the first one again. Standards crucial. The other aspect I think it's very important is, from an IFC perspective, is to build a level of robustness with respect to getting to the bankability stage. And if we can do that, it will help us mobilize money, because money makes the world go round. And so a lot of that is tied to having a framework that everybody is comfortable with. And I think the last one for me is looking beyond just the carbon capture. How do we reduce the cost by actually playing upstream? What are the things that we could do to the processes that could actually reduce the cost downstream of carbon capture and build these unique, innovative business models and ecosystems around CO2.
Yep. Thank you very much. I think all great conclusions and points, but I think what Natalia mentioned, that, and I'm very excited that we're hosting this session focusing on emerging economies, that that there are additional probably issues and problems and the challenges that the emerging economies face, in addition to other challenges that everybody faces with CCS deployment, that is important to talk about. And even like today's panel, there are 4 stakeholders here representing different geographies, different parts of the value chain of CCS, and we heard slightly different views of priorities and the importance of different steps in this game. So what Natalia said, I think, and all of you, I think, mentioned that inclusiveness, discussion, sharing together information, what works. So that probably is a kind of, a universal conclusion from this session and many other sessions we're having at the COP28. So I would like to thank the panel for being here and sharing your perspectives and insights, and thank you the audience for being with us. We'd have to finish now. Thank you very much.